Picture this. A cowboy so broken by life that he's drinking himself to death in a rotting shack, surrounded by nothing but ghosts and regrets. He's lost everything. His ranch burned to ash, his wife dead and buried, his future dissolved in whiskey bottles. He looks like any other washed-up drifter waiting to die. But in 36 hours, this same man will stand before 400 Apache warriors as they kneel in the desert sand and call him brother. What happened between those two moments will leave you speechless. Before we jump back in, comment where you're tuning in from. And if this story has touched you, make sure to subscribe because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Now, let me tell you about Jake Corrigan and the choice that changed history. Jake's weathered hands shook as he lifted the amber whiskey to his cracked lips, his hollow eyes reflecting nothing but emptiness. The abandoned line shack where he'd been slowly killing himself for 3 months sat at the edge of Skeleton Canyon, a forsaken place where only ghosts and regrets dared to tread. The wind howled through gaps in the wooden walls, carrying the scent of approaching winter and the bitter memories of everything he'd lost. His ranch, burned to the ground by Apache raiders 6 months ago. His wife, Sarah, dead from fever while he was away on a cattle drive, buried in a grave he'd never had the courage to visit. His future, dissolved in the bottom of countless whiskey bottles, each one promising relief that never came. The storm had been building for days, and tonight it finally broke with the fury of a wounded animal. Rain hammered against the sagging roof, and lightning split the darkness like God's own judgment. Jake welcomed the chaos. It matched the tempest raging in his soul. That's when he heard it, a sound that cut through the storm's fury and pierced straight through his alcoholic haze. The scream of a dying horse, high and desperate, echoing from somewhere in the canyon below. Jake stumbled to the cracked window, wiping away years of grime with his sleeve. Through the sheets of rain, lightning illuminated a scene that sobered him instantly. An Apache warrior lay pinned beneath his fallen horse, the animal's weight crushing his leg against the rocky ground. Dark blood spread in an ever-widening pool, mixing with the rainwater and mud. The warrior's face was a mask of silent agony, but his eyes, Jake had never seen eyes like those. They held a dignity that transcended pain, a strength that refused to break even in the face of death. Those eyes found Jake's through the storm, and in that moment, two souls recognized something in each other that went beyond the color of skin or the uniform of allegiance. Jake's first instinct was to turn away. Every white man within 100 miles knew the Apache were raiding through the territory, and Colonel Morrison's cavalry was hunting them with orders to shoot on sight. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to let the storm and the wilderness claim another victim and pretend he'd never seen anything. But something in those eyes wouldn't let him turn away. They spoke of honor, of courage, of a man who deserved better than dying alone and forgotten in the mud. Jake had lost everything, his home, his wife, his reason for living. But he hadn't lost his humanity. Not yet. Against every instinct for self-preservation, Jake grabbed his coat and stepped into the storm. The rain hit him like icy needles, and the wind threatened to knock him from his feet. But he pressed forward, drawn by an invisible thread toward the dying warrior. The Apache watched him approach, his hand moving slowly toward the knife at his belt. Pain had not dulled his warrior's instincts. But when Jake dropped to his knees beside the fallen horse and began pushing against its massive weight, the warrior's expression shifted from suspicion to something approaching wonder. "Easy, friend," Jake grunted, his muscles straining against the dead animal's bulk. Rain streamed down his face, mixing with sweat and tears he hadn't realized he was shedding. "Let's get you free." The horse must have weighed 800 pounds, and the mud made every movement treacherous. Jake's boots slipped and slid as he searched for leverage, his hands bleeding from the rough hide and sharp rocks. For 20 agonizing minutes, he threw his entire body weight against the horse, inch by precious inch working to free the trapped warrior. When Jake finally managed to drag the Apache clear, both men collapsed in exhaustion. The warrior's leg was clearly shattered, bone visible through torn flesh, but he was alive. More than alive, he was conscious and alert, his dark eyes studying Jake with an intensity that made the cowboy uncomfortable. The Apache gripped Jake's arm with surprising strength and spoke in careful, accented English. "I am Chief Running Bear of the Chiricahua Apache. Why do you help me, Billy Ashley?" Jake met those proud eyes and saw something he'd forgotten existed. Hope burning bright despite impossible circumstances. Because it's the right thing to do. Running Bear studied Jake's face for a long moment, reading character in the lines carved by wind and sorrow. You have lost much, Cowboy. I see it in your eyes. The same emptiness that haunts my own people. We all lose things, Jake replied, helping the chief sit up against a boulder. Question is what we do with what's left. But what Jake didn't know was that Running Bear wasn't just any Apache chief. He was the most respected peace advocate among his people, a man who had spent years trying to bridge the gap between two cultures sliding inexorably toward total war. What Jake also didn't know was that the leather satchel strapped to Running Bear's chest contained documents that could change everything, if they reached the right hands in time. And what neither man knew was that Colonel Morrison had been orchestrating the entire conflict from behind the scenes, prolonging the bloodshed to justify his illegal weapons sales to both sides of the war. Jake helped Running Bear back to the line shack, the chief's arm draped over his shoulders. Every step was agony for the wounded man, but he never once cried out. His dignity remained intact even as his strength ebbed away. Inside the shack, Jake lit the oil lamp and examined the chief's injuries by its flickering light. The leg was definitely broken, possibly in multiple places, and the loss of blood was severe. Without medical attention, Running Bear would be dead by morning. You need a doctor, Jake said, tearing strips from his own shirt to make bandages. Running Bear shook his head. No white doctor would treat Apache, and my people's medicine man is 3 days' ride north. He winced as Jake cleaned the wounds. It matters not. My mission was already impossible. What mission? Running Bear hesitated, then reached into his satchel with trembling fingers. He withdrew a bundle of papers, each one bearing official seals and signatures. Jake's eyes widened as he recognized some of the names: territorial officials, army commanders, even a signature from Washington. Peace treaty, Running Bear explained, his voice growing weaker. Negotiated in secret for 6 months. Governor Murphy waits in Tucson to sign. If these papers reach him before the new moon. He gestured toward the storm outside. War ends. Apache moved to reservation peacefully. No more killing. Jake's throat went dry. The new moon was tomorrow night. And if they don't reach him? Running Bear's expression grew grim. My war chiefs grow impatient. They have gathered 400 warriors, waiting for my signal. If I do not return with signed treaty by new moon, they attack every settlement from here to Mexico. All of them. No survivors. The magnitude of what Running Bear was saying crashed over Jake like a physical blow. Hundreds, maybe thousands of innocent lives hung in the balance. Women and children in isolated ranches and border towns, completely unaware that death might be riding toward them at sunrise. There's more, Running Bear continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. These papers prove something else. Something that will shock even you, Cowboy. He pulled out another document, this one stained with what looked like blood. Jake leaned closer to read it by lamplight, and what he saw made his hands shake with rage. It was a contract between Colonel Morrison and a weapons dealer in El Paso. Dates, dollar amounts, and inventory lists spelled out a conspiracy that had been running for over a year. Morrison had been selling rifles and ammunition to Apache raiders while simultaneously leading cavalry charges against those same warriors. He was profiting from both sides of a war he was deliberately prolonging. My God, Jake breathed. He's been playing both sides. Your colonel grows rich while good men die, Running Bear confirmed. Apache and white alike. This war could have ended months ago, but Morrison sabotages every peace effort. He needs the fighting to continue, or his illegal profits disappear. As if summoned by mention of his name, the sound of approaching horses cut through the storm. Jake peered through the window and felt his blood turn to ice. 8 riders in cavalry blues were picking their way carefully down the canyon trail, led by a man Jake recognized with sick dread, Sergeant Briggs, Morrison's right hand and the most feared man in the territory. Briggs was known for his cruelty, his complete lack of mercy toward any Apache he encountered. The stories told about him around campfires were the stuff of nightmares, torture, mutilation, atrocities that went far beyond the normal brutalities of war. They're here, Jake whispered, blowing out the lamp. Morrison's men. Running Bear struggled to sit up, reaching for his rifle with hands that shook from blood loss. They know what I carry. Leave me, Bila Ashley. Save yourself while you can. But Jake was already moving, checking his own Winchester and counting ammunition. 6 bullets. Against 8 trained soldiers. Not good odds, but he'd faced worse. You're too important to die here, Jake said grimly. Those papers have to reach Tucson. Impossible. I cannot ride. Cannot even stand. That's when Jake made the decision that would echo through history. He looked toward the makeshift corral outside where his last possession in the world waited. A paint mare named Whiskey, the only thing he had left after losing everything to Morrison's manufactured war. She was a beautiful animal, smart and fast, worth more than most men earned in a year. She represented his only hope of starting over somewhere else, his single remaining connection to the life he'd once known. But as Jake looked at the treaty papers that could end the bloodshed, then at the noble face of the man who'd risked everything to broker peace, the choice became crystal clear. Then take my horse, Jake said simply. Running Bear's eyes widened with shock. I cannot ask such a sacrifice. You're not asking. I'm offering. Jake moved to the window, studying the approaching riders. Whiskey's the fastest horse in the territory. She can get you to Tucson by morning if you push her hard. And you? 8 soldiers will not show mercy to a man who helped Apache. Jake's weathered face hardened with resolve. Then I guess I better make sure they don't take me alive. The sound of hooves was getting closer. Jake helped Running Bear to the back window, every movement causing the chief visible agony. Outside, Whiskey waited in the corral, her coat gleaming even in the storm. She was magnificent, spirited but gentle, loyal but independent. Jake had raised her from a foal, and she was the closest thing to family he had left. Take her, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't hide. She knows these trails better than any cavalry horse. She'll get you through. Running Bear gripped Jake's shoulders with both hands, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Brother, he said in a voice that shook with more than just pain. You are Shikis, my brother. The Chiricahua will never forget this gift. Jake helped Running Bear onto Whiskey's back, securing the treaty papers in the saddlebags and making sure the chief could stay mounted despite his injuries. The mare seemed to sense the urgency of the situation, standing perfectly still as her new rider settled into the saddle. Go, Jake urged, slapping Whiskey's flank. Ride like the devil himself is chasing you. As horse and rider disappeared into the storm, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose. He might be about to die, but his death would mean something. Those papers would reach Tucson. The war would end. Innocent lives would be saved. It was a good way to go. Jake stepped back into the shack just as Sergeant Briggs and his men surrounded the building. Through the rain, he could hear them positioning themselves, cutting off every avenue of escape. Professional soldiers doing what they did best, preparing to kill. Jake checked his Winchester one more time, then opened the door and stepped into the storm. Well, Briggs called out, his voice cutting through the wind like a blade. Jake Corrigan, haven't seen you since your wife's funeral. Heard you'd taken to drinking yourself to death out here in this godforsaken place. Jake kept his rifle lowered but ready. Just a man trying to find some peace, Sergeant. Briggs dismounted, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. Even in the darkness, Jake could see the cruel smile playing at the corners of the sergeant's mouth. Funny thing about peace, Jake? Sometimes it's worth killing for. The other soldiers spread out in a semicircle, their rifles trained on Jake. Professional killers who followed orders without question, no matter how immoral those orders might be. See, we're tracking a particular Apache, Briggs continued, stepping closer. Chief of some kind. Nasty piece of work, from what I understand. Carrying stolen documents, making trouble for honest folk trying to make a living in this territory. Jake met his gaze steadily. Haven't seen any Apache. Just ghosts and memories out here. That's strange, Jake. Because my tracker says Apache pony tracks lead right to your door. Fresh tracks, too. Made within the last hour. Briggs noticed the empty corral, and his expression darkened with understanding. Where's your horse, Jake? Don't tell me you walked all the way out here from town. Horse ran off in the storm, spooked by the lightning. Is that so? Briggs drew his revolver, not quite pointing it at Jake, but making his intentions clear. Tell you what, let's search that shack of yours. Make sure you're not harboring any unwanted guests. 2 soldiers moved toward the building, but that's when it happened. the sound that sent chills down every spine present and changed everything in an instant. The war cry of 400 Apache warriors, echoing from every ridge and canyon wall surrounding the valley. It seemed to come from the earth itself, a sound of such raw power and fury that two of the cavalry horses bolted in terror, leaving their riders stranded in the mud. Impossible, Briggs breathed, his face going white with fear. The nearest Apache are 50 miles south. We had reports. But the sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by the thunder of hundreds of hooves moving through the canyon. The storm clouds seemed to part, and moonlight revealed a sight that would be burned into memory forever. Warriors on horseback emerged from the darkness like vengeful spirits, their faces painted for war, but their weapons held low, in respect. They formed a perfect circle around the line shack, 400 strong, silent as death itself after their initial war cry. Jake's heart nearly stopped when he saw who led them. Running Bear sat tall in Whiskey's saddle, his injured leg bound with strips of doeskin and his face painted with the symbols of a war chief. The treaty papers were gone, delivered successfully to Tucson. But the chief had returned, and he had brought his entire nation with him. Beside Running Bear rode a younger warrior who could only be his son, carrying a staff topped with eagle feathers and wearing the regalia of a peace negotiator. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same proud bearing, the same intelligent eyes, the same unbreakable dignity. "Sergeant Briggs," Running Bear called out, his voice carrying easily across the water-soaked air. "You hunt peace itself, but peace has found protectors." Briggs' hand twitched toward his gun, but the sight of 400 Apache warriors made him freeze. His men looked around wildly, realizing they were outnumbered 50-1 with no hope of escape. "This is a legal assembly," Briggs stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. "I order you to disperse in the name of the United States Army." Running Bear's son rode forward, stopping his horse inches from Briggs. When he spoke, his English was perfect, educated, and precise. "I am Joseph Running Bear, graduate of the Carlisle Indian School and appointed speaker for my people. 1 hour ago, my father delivered certain documents to Governor Murphy in Tucson. Those papers have been authenticated and accepted." The circle of warriors began to close, not threatening but inevitable as the tide. Briggs looked around frantically, sweat mixing with rain on his terrified face. "What documents?" he demanded, but his voice cracked with fear. Joseph smiled, an expression both gentle and terrible. "Evidence of Colonel Morrison's war crimes. Documentation of every illegal weapons sale, every falsified report, every innocent death caused by his greed for profit. The governor has already dispatched federal marshals to arrest the colonel and his co-conspirators." Briggs' face went ashen. "You're lying. You have no proof." "Don't we?" Joseph reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a familiar piece of paper, the contract Jake had seen earlier, proving Morrison's treachery. Signed contracts, payment records, witness testimonies from Apache and white settlers alike. Enough evidence to hang a dozen men for treason. The sergeant's hand moved toward his gun, but 400 Apache warriors shifted almost imperceptibly, and he froze. He was a cruel man, but not a stupid one. Any aggressive move would mean instant death for him and all his men. But first, Running Bear continued, dismounting carefully from Whiskey's back. "We honor the man who made peace possible, the man who chose courage over safety, truth over silence." 4 warriors rode forward, carrying something that made Jake's eyes widen in shock. It was a magnificent war bonnet, its eagle feathers telling the story of countless acts of bravery, its beadwork depicting scenes of honor and sacrifice that stretched back generations. "Shikis," Running Bear said, approaching Jake with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Brother of my spirit, you gave your most precious possession to save not just my life, but the lives of all our peoples. The Chiricahua Nation names you Tsiku Nihilkati, he who stands against the storm." As the war bonnet settled on Jake's shoulders, 400 Apache warriors raised their voices in unison, a sound that seemed to shake the very mountains. In that moment, Jake Corrigan ceased to be a broken-down cowboy drinking away his sorrows and became something he'd never imagined possible, a bridge between two worlds, a living symbol of what was possible when human beings chose compassion over conflict. Sergeant Briggs and his men found themselves slowly backing away as the reality of their situation became clear. They were witnessing history, and their place in it was on the wrong side of justice. "The colonel will hear of this," Briggs threatened weakly. Joseph Running Bear's smile grew wider. "Indeed he will." From his jail cell in the territorial prison. "The peace treaty was signed an hour ago, Sergeant. This war is over. Your illegal profits have ended." As if to emphasize his point, the sound of approaching hooves came from the north, but these weren't Apache ponies. A detachment of federal marshals appeared at the canyon rim, led by a man Jake recognized as Deputy Marshal Williams, known throughout the territory for his honesty and fairness. "Sergeant Briggs," Williams called out as he rode down into the valley. "By federal authority, you and your men are under arrest for conspiracy, treason, and violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice." The game was over. Morrison's conspiracy had been exposed, his illegal war had been ended, and justice was finally being served. Briggs and his men surrendered without resistance, knowing that any fight would be hopeless against such overwhelming odds. As the soldiers were led away in chains, Running Bear approached Jake again. The chief moved slowly, still favoring his injured leg, but his eyes shone with joy and gratitude. "Brother," he said, placing both hands on Jake's shoulders, "you have given me back my horse, but that is the smallest of your gifts. You have given both our peoples a chance for peace. How can such a debt ever be repaid?" Jake looked around at the 400 warriors who had claimed him as family, at the federal marshals ensuring justice was served, at the storm clouds finally breaking to reveal stars shining bright in the desert sky. "It's already been repaid," he said quietly. "You've given me something worth more than any horse, a reason to keep living." 3 days later, Colonel Morrison was arrested at his headquarters in Tucson. The weapons cache found in his private quarters contained enough evidence to convict him and a dozen co-conspirators of treason against the United States. The sentences were harsh: life imprisonment for some, execution for others who had directly ordered the murder of innocent civilians. The peace treaty was ratified by both the territorial government and the Apache Nation. For the first time in over a decade, white settlers and Native Americans could travel the desert trails without fear. Trading posts opened that welcomed customers regardless of the color of their skin. Children began to play together at the edges of settlements, learning each other's languages and customs. Jake Corrigan never returned to his bottle. Instead, he became the territorial liaison between the Apache Nation and the government, a position he held with honor and distinction until his death 40 years later. He never married, but he was never alone. 400 brothers had sworn to stand with him always, and they kept that promise. The Paint Mare Whiskey lived to be 32, spending her final years in the place of honor at the center of the Chiricahua camp. Apache children learned to ride on her back, and tribal elders told stories of the night she carried hope through a storm to save two nations from destroying each other. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in the territory itself. Word spread of the cowboy who chose compassion over safety, and others began to follow his example. Small acts of kindness between cultures became common. Intermarriage between Apache and white families was accepted and even celebrated. A new generation grew up knowing that the color of a person's skin mattered far less than the content of their character. Years later, when historians studied the end of the Apache Wars, they would point to political pressures and military strategies. But the Apache themselves knew the truth. It all began with one broken-down cowboy who heard a horse's dying scream in a storm and chose to answer with his heart instead of his fears. In the Chiricahua oral tradition, they still tell the story of Tsiku Nihilkadi, he who stands against the storm. They speak of how individual courage can change the course of rivers, how a single act of compassion can echo through generations, and how sometimes the smallest sacrifices yield the greatest transformations. Jake Corrigan gave away his last horse to save a dying stranger. In return, he received something worth far more than all the horses in the territory: a brotherhood that transcended the boundaries of blood and culture, and the knowledge that when darkness threatens to overwhelm the world, sometimes all it takes is one person willing to step into the storm. The war ended not with a great battle, but with a simple choice made by a man who had lost everything and found that he still had the most important thing of all: the capacity to care about someone else's suffering more than his own safety. And in the end, That made all the difference.